Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrew Cameron. I work at the American Association of Port Authorities, and I'm happy to have you all here for this wonderful webinar that we are having during Infrastructure Week on behalf of United for Infrastructure. We at AAPA here have been working with the Committee on the Marine Transportation System to provide you with some really good content today, focused on how infrastructure policy affects the marine transportation system. I'm going to be kind of in the background answering some of your questions, if you have any questions, using the question feature, as well as helping all the speakers if they have technical difficulty. But without any ado, I'm going to introduce Chris Connor, American Association of Port Authorities President and CEO. He's going to be moderating the panel and doing some introductions for everybody. So Chris, take it away.
Great. First of all, thank you, Andrew. Thank you for that introduction. Welcome, everyone, to this panel. Let me just explain the process that I'll follow. I'm just going to chat for a few minutes here and give a couple of high-level talking points, seen from an AAPA perspective. I know that the points I'm going to raise are, I'm with kindred spirits in terms of the other panelist members, but there'll certainly be some good points just to frame the rest of the discussion. And then I'm going to introduce U.S. Coast Guard Rear Admiral Richard Timmy, who will address the group for a few minutes. And at the conclusion of Rear Admiral Timmy's comments, we'll move to the panel discussion, and I'll introduce each panel member and give their bio individually as they go through their respective remarks. And at the conclusion of the last panelist, which is Catherine Chambers from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, we'll move into the Q&A session. So that's the framework. Some kind of high-level talking points, seen from our seats at AAPA. And again, I know that I'm with like-minded thinkers here, but clearly seaports are creating jobs and have created jobs across the country for some time. Seaport activity supports the employment of more than 31 million Americans. Seaport-related jobs provide 1.4 trillion, that's with a T, in personal income and local spending. And for every $1 billion in exports shipped through U.S. seaports, 15,000 U.S. jobs are created. AAPA recently concluded a 5-year survey. We call it our Port Planned Infrastructure Investment Survey. This was completed prior to the impact of COVID-19. At that point in time, U.S. seaports and their port property tenants plan to invest $163 billion in port-related infrastructure over the 5-year period from 2020 through 2025. That's up 5.4% from the 2016 survey. The bottom line is it's critical that ports, their tenants, and supply chain partners remain intact and able to facilitate the post-pandemic economic recovery. Again, cargo activities at U.S. ports generate a total economic value that equates to 26% of U.S. GDP. Federal investments into port-related infrastructure are crucial to support and ensure that these planned port investments are made to put America and Americans back to work. With those general comments, I'd like to turn the floor over, and we're delighted to have U.S. Coast Guard Rear Admiral Richard Timmy. Sir?
Good afternoon, everyone. How's that for the audio? You got me?
Perfect.
Okay, listen, we're working with the technology here. So, hey, I want to, Chris, thank everybody for their participation, and Jace, thanks for your work on setting this up, and my staff as well. None of this is easy as we adjust to the reality of how we come together as a workplace, as schools, and as broader communities with interests like ours here in CMTS to try and come together in a virtual way and still advance the important work that we all have to do. So again, thanks to United for Infrastructure for kind of emphasizing the importance of infrastructure and bringing in this opportunity to talk the maritime transportation system in that broader context of infrastructure for our country. And then AAPA, Chris, thank you again so much for partnering with CMTS here as we, echo that sentiment of how important the marine transportation system is to our nation's economic and national security interests. A few months ago, at the beginning of the pandemic, the Coast Guard took a number of steps to accommodate the realities that we saw out in the MTS. On a day-to-day basis, our program here is about addressing risk in the marine transportation system. We do that through credentialing mariners and inspecting vessels and regulating port communities and trying to drive risk out. But we had to adjust to where we saw that risk. And the fact was that the loss of the marine transportation system to a COVID impact because mariners were too sick to go to sea or port workers were too sick to move cargo out of warehouses and in ports, that became the real risk back in March and April that we wanted to address. And so we adjusted a whole bunch of policies to make sure that the nation was well served by a functioning MTS and the men and women who keep it going. That is the reality of our country. 95% of the goods that we all enjoy in our consumer society come through our ports. And if you remember, it was really weird. There were things missing from the shelves at our grocery stores. And that has to be something that first and foremost you go back to and say, this is how important the MTS is to our economy and our way of life. And so it's so important. And I'm so glad to see the wonderful array of folks we've brought together today to talk about some of the issues that affect the MTS and infrastructure. Chris, you used a bunch of the numbers that I was going to use, so I won't use them all. But, we have the Commandant has signed out a strategy here on the Maritime Commerce Strategic Outlook, which was really about our MTS. And the number we use is that $5.4 trillion of annual economic activity you can trace to the maritime. That was, I think, the 20% of GDP figure you used a moment ago. And we use a figure of 31 million jobs, American jobs associated with the ports. This is our task, our burden, our challenge, our awesome working relationship with stakeholders that we get to work with here. So CMTS, for those of you not familiar with the Committee on Marine Transportation System, who is our joint sponsor here with AAPA, the CMTS is a cabinet level committee chaired by Secretary of DOT, and then with a coordinating board at the Rear Admiral SES level that brings the interagency together to deal with the marine transportation system in a holistic way, looking across the interagency to make sure that we're kind of at least aware of what each other is doing at the minimum, and at the maximum that we're coordinating and all rowing in the same direction, pulling on the same oar to make sure that the policies and the public policy decisions we make are all moving our stakeholders in the same direction. So it's been a great experience over my career to be familiar with the CMTS and now be in a unique position to go ahead and chair the coordinating board for this year. And as we took over as the Coast Guard took over that coordinating board role, we've put out our priorities: leverage emergent technologies in the MTS, promote improvements to the MTS infrastructure as a national priority, enhance the unity of effort in the marine transportation system, and support the evolving future of offshore industries. These build upon the last few years of work by the other chairs that have sat here, either from Army Corps or from NOAA. And you'll have caught in there just not just tangential piece of infrastructure, but the priority piece of infrastructure built into our focus over this year. And that's not new. I updated Admiral Gallaudet's infrastructure kind of focus to make sure that we continue to do that. I think at least one of our panelists here is probably way smarter than I am on this, but when you talk about investing in marine transportation system infrastructure and the return on that dollar, it's an amazing value proposition for where we can create growth and where we have need for capability and capacity in our ports. And so I think this body, as we discuss this today, you'll hear some smarter people and I talk about what that return on investment is, where we need to put it, what we can expect from the volume and capacity in our ports, and the real challenge we'll have, at least from a Coast Guard perspective and a government perspective, of keeping up with industry, keeping up with the technologies that become the status quo in the private sector, and that we will continue to need to adjust our regulatory schemes and our policy schemes to account for the reality of what technology is in our ports. That remains a challenge for us, and it'll remain something we continue to focus on. COVID. So I opened the discussion with some of our pandemic responses, some of the things that we have out there that will continue to challenge us, and it continues to challenge the industry. I know for those of you who are privy to the MARAD call each week that they do, either with the U.S. fleet or the ports authorities or some of the stakeholder groups, and ongoing discussions have really continued to highlight the impacts of COVID, either to our workforce's training and credentialing, the need for testing, coordinated testing, PPE, things that challenge us across the broader society. But for our maritime stakeholders who are critical to keeping these ports open, it becomes where does our voice fit into the cacophony of asks for testing and PPE? And hopefully we've seen that come through the CMTS, come through MARAD, to make sure that those stakeholders and those of us who are trying to support the MTS infrastructure, make sure that those stakeholders are heard and have an avenue for resolution. Some of the things that still remain for resolution, though, we're working on a COVID working group that will continue to kind of baseline all the federal policies across different across the interagency, so that our private sector folks who are trying to comply, trying to deal with the reality of COVID in each port that they visit around the country, have kind of a baseline to work from to make sure that they can adjudicate the issues that they come up with when they have positive mariners or positive warehouse workers or positive stevedores, the folks who affect that infrastructure directly. And so the CMTS has a COVID working group that we stood up in July that will continue to work those issues. And then lastly, I'll just end with, from a broader perspective across the globe, we're not the only ones who have this challenge. And you've seen some news stories if you're so inclined, you would have seen some news stories on the challenges for seafarers around the world. A few months ago, the story was how many cruise ship passengers were at sea, and then how many cruise ship crew members were stuck at sea. There's still over 200,000 mariners at sea beyond their contracts that they agreed to sign up for with their companies. And they're there still at sea because they can't be repatriated, either through a lack of access at the port states where they're calling on, or a lack of transportation back to their home countries, which continues to mean they are essentially just forced to remain at sea. And so we'll talk to this in our working group, but really the IMO and the international bodies are addressing that. It's kind of a tangential to the infrastructure piece that we'll discuss today, but I think it's part and parcel of the COVID impacts to our MTS that we're all continuing to address, even 7-8 months down the road. My crystal ball is broken. I do not know what 3 months will look like from now, and so we continue to all go into that, assuming the best, planning for the worst, but working together to make sure that we have a unity of effort in the way we approach this really, hopefully once in a lifetime issue with this pandemic. So, pending any direct questions from me, I want to just say one more time, thank you to the CMTS staff who worked so hard putting this together, to my staff for preparing me, and for APA and Chris and your folks for co-sponsoring with this with us and bringing these panelists together for just a great session this afternoon.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for those comments. And I would just add on to one thing you said. I've had the privilege of being a participant in many of those MARAD calls. I an observation I made over the many weeks is, you know, those stakeholders that you referred to that are part of the marine transportation system, we are an incredibly proud group, because nary did I hear in any of those sessions, you know, anybody with their, you know, their hat out crying in their soup about, you know, how unfair this was. Everybody was focused on what we're doing now and how we're going to make this better. And it was honestly very revealing, you know, how people behave in crisis mode. You can climb down the rabbit hole and drag a lot of stuff down with you, or you can keep your head well above the horizon and keep focused on how we get through this. Makes me feel proud that I'm with an industry group, and it's a broad group of participants, right? You know, that puts community and country first. So it's been very good, and thank you for raising that point.
I'd echo that. You're spot on that.
Thank you for being with us. All right,
Sure.
Now to our first panelist. Let me properly introduce him. Guy St. John is the Apprentice Program Manager with Oceaneering. Oceaneering is a subsea and applied technology company that provides engineered services and hardware to customers who operate in marine, space, and other environments. In his capacity, Guy works closely with partners in the maritime industry, the Department of Labor, Virginia Community College System, and the Southeast Maritime and Transportation Center, and local workforce investment boards to identify and prioritize in-demand workforce credentials. Guy is a U.S. Navy veteran and received his BS in education from Texas A&M University. Guy, welcome, and the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much. Am I on?
We got you.
Okay, great.
Yes, yep.
So thank you for the introduction. I'm very honored to be here today to talk about one of the building blocks of any infrastructure plan, which has got to be your employees. So in my capacity as the Apprentice Program Manager, we built an apprentice program in the maritime, in our maritime business. And the Marine Services Division of Oceaneering International is the DoD contracting arm that works directly with the United States Navy, and in particular, the United States Navy Submarine Force. So I'm going to keep to the tenets of staff work, which is accuracy, brevity, and clarity. I'm also going to fall back on my training in naval aviation and try to be faster and funnier. So why registered apprenticeship, and why should you even consider it? Well, registered apprenticeship at its core is a workforce development initiative that builds you a better employee. And it builds that better employee because it's building the employee, the new employee, to your specifications. So you may think, well, I've got that already with an in-house training program. Why do I need to do that? Well, registering with the U.S. Department of Labor as a sponsor tells the U.S. government that you're going to take your employees through a structured level of training, sometimes with apprentice-related instruction through the community college or other registered third-party entities to create an employee that is competency-based or time-based, met the requirements of your program as you want them to be built. So if it's important that infrastructure have stevedores and high voltage electricians and outside machinists and crane operators, and I believe, by the way, the Port of Virginia just had one of the largest container ships come in either yesterday or today along the eastern seaboard, and all the infrastructure that goes along with that. Welders, accordion makers. What? Accordion makers? Yes. Who doesn't love a good accordion in the maritime industry? An accordion maker is actually a registered apprenticeship. It's a registered trade with the Department of Labor. So it builds that building block of employee to become the best employee that you invest in, that ends up being trained to your requirements. It's customized training. It's built for you. If it's important that your high voltage electricians take Shakespeare, that's okay. You probably want them to take some electricity and electrical courses as well. If it's important that they know their Shakespeare while they're down on the waterfront, then so be it. What you get as an employer, as an industry, is by investing in those employees, is that they are going to invest right back in you. Just a couple of years ago, the average age of the shipyard worker in any of the either public or private yards was about 54 years old. That means that when these individuals, these men and women retire and they walk through the gate for the last time, the experience that they've gained over 20 or 30 years in the shipyard industry is lost without having someone come behind them who they are willing to train and bring up in a non-threatening way, because the young person is not going to take their jobs because we currently can't meet the need for the number of required jobs in any of these industries. So it's non-threatening, but you get the best employee that's possible. So it's a systematic approach that ensures that employees are trained and certified to produce at the highest skill level possible. So it all starts with a conversation. You know, we're all checklist driven people, and in order to have an apprentice program, there's a small checklist you need to go through with the Department of Labor. I'm not going to go through that here with you, but I will let you know that my contact information will be available at the end of this presentation, and I will help anyone with any questions at any time, because the bottom line with this is that a rising tide lifts all boats, and the more qualified, certified, trained journeymen, journey workers that we can have in the shop and the waterfront, working IT, building accordions, the better it is for all of us. Just to back up for a second and to talk about oceaneering at large, oceaneering is an engineering and service provider primary to offshore oil and gas. But we do a lot of cool things with space systems out of Houston and remotely operated vehicles. We are an international country, so we are around the edges of a lot of places, just like the port authorities. I'm happy to listen to the rest of the brief and stand by for the question and answer periods.
That's perfect, Guy. That's exactly what we'll do. I have a question or two in mind for you, so we'll hold those to the end. Thank you for those words, and also thank Oceaneering for being a recent member of AAPA. We're delighted to have you and look forward to spending some time with you, albeit virtually for the time being, but there will come a day when we'll be able to sit down and have a beer together, I hope.
That's exactly right, and you will get the first round.
Yes, sir. Okay, thank you. Our next speaker is Jeff Pollock. Jeff is the Chief Strategy Officer at the Port of Corpus Christi. Jeff was appointed to that position in August 2020. He joined the port as their first Director of Planning in late July of 2018. And prior to that, Jeff was the Executive Director of the Corpus Christi Metropolitan Planning Organization, which is a federally funded to help plan, coordinate, and fund transportation projects of all types. Jeff is a big picture community and environmental planner who specializes in growth and land use issues in the coastal zones. Jeff has a bachelor's degree in environmental science from Northwestern University and a master's degree in coastal environmental management from the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke University, where he was a Doris Duke Conservation Fellow. Jeff is a certified planner through the American Institute for Certified Planners and is an Envision Sustainability professional through the Institute for Sustainable Infrastructure. Jeff, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, can I get some sort of validation that you guys can hear me, not just see my lips moving out there?
We can hear you.
All right, thank you so much, and really appreciate that detailed introduction. Actually, I have no idea where that bio came from, but thank you so much, and thanks to all of you for the chance to visit with you today. Actually, if we can go ahead and skip to the next slide here, maybe I'll just take 2 seconds to, since we're beaming ourselves in from all corners of the country, just to ground us in the physical reality of Corpus Christi. We are on the west side of the Gulf of Mexico, about 3.5 hours southwest of Galveston and the Houston area, for those of you who know it. And if maybe one more, if you don't mind, please. And we at the port are home to a 36-mile long ship channel that stretches from the Gulf of Mexico on the right-hand side of your screen across Corpus Christi Bay. And then of that 36 miles, 7 or so miles is what we refer to as our inner harbor. And I mention this only because on the north side of that inner harbor is our primary freight corridor, the Joe Fulton International Trade Corridor, which I'll be referencing in just a few minutes with some slides about a case study that we've implemented there. So if we can continue on. Quick snapshot of who we are as a port. We are principally a liquid bulk port, depending how you slice the numbers in any given year. Over the last few years, we've been the top 1 or 2 ports for energy export in the country. If any of our friends from Houston are on the call, we like to rib each other about who's in that #1 slot. But certainly, as Texas shale plays have figured so prominently in the energy renaissance in our country, and so much of that energy finds its way offshore by way of coastal Texas ports. All of us who are in the liquid bulk business have enjoyed a few really productive years, with more to come in the near future. Okay, next slide, thanks. So this question of what technological innovation means for infrastructure is something that I'm really flattered to be able to sort of plant some seeds around. I would never suggest that I am the expert on this subject of the diversity of folks who are on this call, but I really appreciate the chance to just share a few thoughts. It's something that I can say that in my practice at the port and in the lines of the organization that fall under my purview, which is to say planning, environmental, and all things geospatial, it's something that we are dealing with either implicitly or explicitly every day. And what you see in front of you is what we refer to as our technology advancement program framework. So what we have done essentially is pull together all of the disparate initiatives related to technology and innovation, and we've put them under this umbrella of our TAP program. The colors that you see represented refer to 5 of the 6 strategic goals in our organizational strategic plan. And I share this not to dive into the details in this format, but only to convey that from my perspective, as my team and I contemplate this question of where to embrace innovation and what that innovation means for the way we do business, it is a question that touches all aspects of our physical being as a gateway. I mean, we as ports are inherently multimodal junctions, and there is innovation emerging on all fronts. And so the question of what our ports will look like in 5, 10, 50 years is just a really fundamental question that I think is a rabbit hole it's easy to go down, and I'm going to try to add a little structure to it if we can go to the next slide. So if we hone in on the initiatives in that TAP program for us that I feel like are the most prominent, the most emerging, we start to see some themes emerge, and I'll unpack these further in subsequent slides. But for us, UAS, unmanned aerial systems, are unquestionably going to play a very prominent role in the way we do business. And I suspect that there are a number on the call who are nodding their heads, having already embraced that technology in the port environment. Likewise, vehicle automation and vessel automation, and that doesn't mean necessarily full automation, but one of the 5 levels of automation is unequivocally going to change the way that we move goods and the physical built environment that we build to accommodate those freight vehicles. And lastly, I think there are some really interesting things happening around payment platforms and in virtual spaces that could dramatically expedite sort of the transactions that make up our daily experience. So let me try to distill some of those themes down even further if we can go to the next slide. So, you know, for us, if we talk about the modalities that intermingle in the port environment, I think most of us are moving goods on, you know, in 4 ways, and there are some exceptions. Some of us do more of one than the other, but if we look at what infrastructure looks like physically in each of those 4 modes, I think we can start to talk about where innovation is driving, you know, physical form, and where that physical form is changing the way that we operate, and vice versa, right? There's a bit of a chicken and the egg question there. So starting on the air side, and you know, at our port, in our Port Authority, we have no jurisdiction over airborne movement of goods. However, there is no question that the use of aerial systems, drones, unmanned systems, is changing the way we do business on the ground. And if you look at the bullets in each of these boxes, you know, they ratchet up in intensity as you move down the list. I think that the low-hanging fruit with respect to drone applications in the port environment for most of us is in enhancing the way we do security at our borders. But what we're quickly seeing is that drone-based data collection for both environmental data and for commercial data, for example, measuring the way tenants are using laydown space and quantifying that laydown space as a way to, you know, tighten up our billing and revenue capture, that's pretty low-hanging fruit. But if you think about it, it has profound implications for the way that we allocate our space. I mean, we no longer necessarily need to leave space around a laydown footprint for manual measurement, right? So there's an element of ratcheting up efficiency that an opportunity that presents. And lastly, I think the day will come probably sooner than a lot of us expect when we see unmanned systems actually creating a modal link between other more conventional modes in a port environment. That's less likely to be the case in our case, where we're dealing with liquid bulk, but we're already seeing those systems used for deliveries on the receiving end, on the customer end of freight chains, and I think we'll continue to see that happen in the port environment. When we talk about the land side, rail and truck movements, I think the real story, and I again, nothing profound here or shocking here, is one of increasing connectivity and automation. And again, you know, we need not talk necessarily about full automation, but levels 2 and 3 automation. What does that heavily assisted automation technology look like, and how does it change the way that we build freight corridors? How does it change the way we build queuing lanes or parking areas? How does it change the way that we coordinate and schedule freight arrivals and departures in our gateways? I will say that something that gives me real pause here is the rate of change and technological evolution in the freight space, in the truck space, is so fast that what we're, and conversely, the pace at which we are upgrading our roadway infrastructure is so slow that what we're seeing is the technologists on the truck side are adapting their technology to fit into our conventional roadway infrastructure, which I think is terribly scary because it propagates the status quo in terms of the way that we build our roadway network. And unless we catch up quickly on the infrastructure side, we will see a real opportunity missed, because the real promise of increasing automation and connectivity is our ability to shrink the amount of space that we dedicate to moving vehicles and moving goods by vehicle. And so unless we find a way for that infrastructure to keep pace to some degree with the sophistication of our vehicles, we are really propagating the status quo in terms of the amount of our communities and our landscape that's dedicated to moving vehicles. And I think that's a real tragedy. So I hope that's a conversation that's happening in many of your ports and at the state level with your DOTs, the national level with the DOT. So one last thing on the vehicular side, I do have a couple slides after this about an intelligent transportation system pilot that we have on that freight corridor I mentioned at the beginning. To me, ITS is sort of the gateway drug to real CV and AV ready corridors. ITS just means enhanced systems, enhanced data collection at intersections, incorporating smart sensing technology to get a better sense of how vehicles are moving on our roadways. It helps with incident management when such intervention is needed, but it gives us that granular look at how vehicles operate on our corridors. That is really the essential step to allow us to really prepare for more connectivity and more automation. I think the lessons we learn in the vehicular space will at some point translate into what we're seeing in the maritime space, particularly for me when I look at the volume of brown water barges that utilize our intracoastal systems, particularly along the Gulf Coast. For example, in our case, we see 4,000 or so barge movements in and out of our gateway a year. I mean, it's a staggering number, and the majority of those are inshore barges, not ocean-going barges, and many of them are making kind of a milk run up and down, the Gulf Coast. To me, there's tremendous potential there for enhancing the sophistication, the smart sensing technology of our aids to navigation, and the way that those aids to navigation connect with our barge fleet to ratchet up a degree of connectivity and fundamental level automation that I think will enhance efficiency, will enhance our revenue capture on the commercial side, and will dramatically enhance safety. And then lastly, for us, we talk a lot about the underground infrastructure that few people see. When we talk about freight infrastructure, I think that our pipeline network across the country is what we tend to underrepresent. And we know that when we're moving freight by pipe, we're keeping trucks off the road, we're minimizing interruptions in our communities. And so talking about how to do that more efficiently in a way that, even though it's a particularly safe mode, how do we ratchet up that safety even further with better gauges, better sensing technology? How do we translate that volume monitoring into more efficient billing and more efficient transactions for our customer base, and ultimately for the end users, whether those are refiners, whether those are overseas customers. When you amplify that across the energy space in the country, it has implications for energy security at a national scale and for our GDP at a national scale. So I think when we talk about the shape of our infrastructure, it's critical that we don't emphasize the importance of that pipeline piece. If we can flip to the next slide, and I'll fly through these in just a couple seconds, but the ITS platform that we've deployed at the Port of Corpus Christi is the MyoVision traffic link platform, essentially high definition 360-degree cameras at multiple intersections to allow us to get real-time telemeter data on vehicle movements by class. If we can flip to the next slide, you can see and one more slide, please, if you don't mind, Chase. Thanks. You can see what the real-time dashboard looks like that we have access to 24 hours a day. And we get counts by class, we get truck movement information in a very nuanced, granular way, which has value for us on the security side, has value on the operational side. But when you step back and look at it globally, it helps us understand our freight corridors in a granular and nuanced way that we can't with just traditional data collection means. And I personally feel that this is the key to being able to make the leap to upgrading our corridors to really the level of sophistication that we are ultimately striving for in terms of connectivity and automation. I think we have to have this degree of understanding of the way our corridors are being used currently in order to make that next strategic link and to try to keep pace with the evolution of technology in the vehicle space. So I believe that's my last slide. I don't think there's anything behind this other than my contact information, but look forward to an engaging dialogue and would welcome the chance to visit with anyone on the call at a later date.
Okay, Jeff, thank you. That was an excellent presentation. Thanks for your energy. Couldn't agree with you more on the need to get into next generation solutions. But we do seem to be in a a cycle or a circle of events where we're solving, 10 years ago's lack of investment. But I do think what you hit on at the end, artificial intelligence and data, will point us more clearly towards the future and put money and resources into that. So thanks again for being part of this today.
Okay.
Our next panelist is Ron Horst. Ron is the Director of Research at Inforum at the University of Maryland. Ron started with Inforum in 2001 as a research assistant and joined the full-time staff after receiving his PhD at the University of Maryland in 2006. He directs research activities, including model development and application of these models to policy analysis and forecasting. Ron leads production of semi-annual macroeconomic industry forecasts and monthly macroeconomic forecasts. He serves as the principal investigator for projects including analysis of the exhibition industry and provision of specialized industry forecasts. His expertise includes the economics of public infrastructure, freight flow projections, energy economics, projections of detailed industry data, and analysis of terroristic attacks and other economic impacts. Ron also has been the chief software developer at Inforum since the retirement of Klopper Allman in 2003. Ron, welcome to this panel, and the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Chris. And Chase, if you could, thank you. So, as many of you know, in 2019, we worked with the CMTS to study the economics of MTS infrastructure. And what I'll be presenting here is a very brief summary of that study. And you can read the report on the at the CMTS website. So recent trends in infrastructure investment reflect mixed performance. So spending for some privately owned infrastructure, for example, freight rail and electric utilities, has been relatively strong. On the other hand, public spending for roads, maritime systems, and many other types of public infrastructure has lagged. And this generally leads to slower economic growth as a consequence. So real or inflation-adjusted spending on public infrastructure simply has not kept pace with economic growth, particularly over the past 2 decades. So this particularly is true for water transportation infrastructure, including ports and waterways, and it also is true for water resources, sometimes called conservation and development. That's a bit broader than together these are a bit broader than the MTS concept, but water resources also include some important elements of MTS, such as dredging and dams. So despite the vital services these systems provide the US economy, many of them need long overdue and substantial maintenance, repair, and modernization. And in this particular slide, we see that although the US economy has continued to grow over the past 20 years, inflation-adjusted spending for public infrastructure in general and for MTS infrastructure in particular has declined. So, next slide. So here we see some of the same information, but in more detail for the last period from 2001 to 2017. And since the turn of the 21st century, escalation of construction prices eroded effective investment levels because each dollar of funding simply purchased relatively less infrastructure capital. And so while total real spending has actually fallen, capital spending in particular has declined substantially, even as operations and maintenance spending has continued to rise at low to moderate rates. The implication of these trends is a steady erosion of the nation's essential MTS infrastructure base. And these data come largely from the US Congressional Budget Office. Next slide. And so in the CMTS study, we considered 3 alternative hypothetical programs to improve MTS infrastructure and to assess the economic benefits of doing so. And so here we summarize the assumptions for scenario 3, which was the most ambitious improvement program that we considered. So this scenario included 11 years of enhanced capital spending, totaling $87 billion spread over 2020 to 2030, along with permanently higher spending for operations and maintenance. And this spending reached up to $28 billion per year. And what's shown here in this slide is nominal spending, spending in actual dollars. And last slide. Next slide. So here we have another look at the basic assumptions for scenario 3. This time showing real or inflationary spending increases, where spending increases are relative to the baseline levels. So also shown are corresponding effects of this additional spending on real GDP and employment. So the initial boost to GDP and employment largely are due to the increased construction activity, along with continuing stimulus coming from permanently higher O&M spending. And these together constitute demand side effects of the higher spending levels. In the medium to long run, though, it's improved supply side conditions that generally mean lower costs for industries directly and indirectly reliant on MTS that helps to sustain higher GDP, employment, and incomes. And this is largely by making domestic producers more competitive in world markets. And so over the long term, competitiveness, output, and employment across industries could be improved by the productivity enhancing effects of better infrastructure. Chris?
Thank you, sir, for that. And we'll come back to some questions for you at the conclusion of the last panelist. I'll move now to our final panelist today. Catherine Flynn Chambers is a research physical scientist, Coastal Processes Branch, Coastal and Hydraulics Laboratory for the U.S. Army Engineer Research and Development Center. Catherine is a research scientist with expertise in analytical approaches to resilience in the marine transportation system. For the past 6 years, she has focused on studying the concepts of resilience as they pertain to the marine transportation and emergency response business lines of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. She's an active member of several international working groups on the marine and inland transportation system and a young member of the Transportation Research Board Ports and Harbors Committee and co-leads an interagency team entitled the Resilience Integrated Action Team as a part of the U.S. Committee on the Maritime Transportation System. Catherine has an MS from Purdue University's Ecological Science and Engineering Interdisciplinary Program. Catherine, welcome to the panel.
Thank you so much, Chris. I appreciate that introduction. Every time this happens, I make a note to shorten those acronyms. So I appreciate you forging through it. I'll wait until the slides are up. Can you all hear me okay?
We got you.
Can you hear me?
Loud and clear. Yep.
Thank you. All right, so today we're going to walk through, well, I was given the job to describe what resilience means for the marine transportation system in light of infrastructure and a lot of the conversations we've already had today. So we'll jump right into it. Next slide. The first thing you need to know about talking about resilience in any sort of way is how to define it. And at the Army Corps of Engineers, we define it in a series of 4 steps. That includes preparation, resistance or absorption, recovery, and adaptation. They allow for a lot of flexibility, though, in between our business lines and the work that we do. And this flexibility can be really useful to say, oh, yes, we do resilient stuff. But it can also be a problem when you start to, or when you're asked to apply these concepts to make management decisions. It's subjective and it can be applied in a lot of different ways. Next slide. And I will warn you guys, I have a little bit of bandwidth delay, so if the timing's awkward, that's why. Because I work for the Corps of Engineers and I am a data scientist, I will warn you ahead of time, I love color, I love graphs, and I love seeing patterns in data, so get ready. The Corps of Engineers, well, we also define resilience in terms of function, how your systems are able to provide the things that you need from them. So this is how to look at that cycle over a graph, a functionality over time graph. So you have your ability to prepare, you get hit by some sort of a disruption, your functionality drops as you're resisting or absorbing that hazard or disruption. You have your recovery time, and in between storms or hazards or earthquakes, ideally, you're able to adapt or evolve so that the next time you encounter a disruption, your resilience is increased, you have less loss in functionality, and you can recover quickly. So Resilience 101, already covered, you all are experts. Next slide. The marine transportation system is really difficult though, because it is so complicated. The next slide covers the external components and the internal components of the MTS. This is a whole variety of things. We've already heard a lot about it today. It's your labor force, it's your intermodal exchanges, it's the automatic identification information systems, the technologies that are supporting what you do. It's the global supply chain, it's public funding. So there's a whole lot that you need to consider when you start to make investment or management decisions based on resilience within the MTS. It's a big thing and it's very complicated. Next step. Next slide. So there are a lot of challenges to implementing resilience. What we're finding is resilience is still a call to action. There's been, in the past few years, there's been funding tied to resilience for federal funds or grants. And it's really hard to wrap your arms around that system-wide understanding about how all of these components are working together so that you can build resilience within your system. So if you click ahead, there's a couple needs that have come out of this that we've identified within the work that we do. The first is that resilience assessments can be subjective, and the definition of resilience is hard to pin down. And so there's a need for the development of tools and applications that our federal agencies and partners can use to quantify coastal system resilience. Next slide. So in this presentation, I'm going to briefly cover two different methods to do this. The first is qualitative, or the information that you get from discussions. So in order to answer, sorry, I skipped ahead a little bit. In order to answer this first need about assessments being subjective and applied with varied meanings, is we're working to develop methodologies for understanding resilience. So we're gathering all the things that we know, the data sets we can use, the methods that we can use to talk to people, and we're trying to wrap our arms around what it means, how to measure it, and what needs are still out there. Next slide, please. And like I already said, there's a couple different ways to do this. There's qualitative methods, discussions, and exchange of information, and then there's quantitative, which is numbers and indices. And one of the qualitative methods that we're using is through the Committee on the Marine Transportation System Resilience Integrated Action Team, or the RIAT. This is a committee that I co-lead with NOAA, and we have 12 member agencies And we have been tasked by the coordinating board to get together and to review some of the past hurricane seasons, and now COVID-19 season, if you could call it that, and to try to understand some of the implications for marine transportation system resilience. Next slide. So this started with an analysis of the 2017 hurricane season. You had over 45 ports across a huge geographic area impacted by 3 major storms simultaneously. No one on this call probably needs me to repeat that this 2017 hurricane season was a big deal. So what we did as a team was to get together a lot of those agencies that had experience in responding to these storms so that they could talk about what the challenges were that they faced with each of them, and they all had their unique challenges for sure, and what the successes were. And we gathered that information to provide some recommendations for what we called a resilient path forward for the marine transportation system. And that report is available on the CMTS website. Next slide. But more recently, we have had the 2018 and 2019 hurricane seasons. We're always a few hurricane seasons short with all of these major storms that we're getting. In 2018, you had Hurricane Florence and Hurricane Michael that each had their own very unique forcing and their own very unique successes and challenges. Florence hit the coastal Carolinas and had a major downpour of precipitation. So it was really the rainfall that impacted the area after the initial arrival of the storm that cut off a lot of the first responders and communities in that area and created some secondary challenges to infrastructure and to getting people back to work that needed to be worked around. Hurricane Michael was really fast and really localized, and it completely destroyed everything in its path when it arrived. And it also brought some, I guess, realizations that we aren't necessarily going to have a long time, long as, I guess, a subjective word, but we're not going to have much time to prepare before a hurricane arrives. So having all those plans ahead of time and pre-placement of materials was important there. And then in 2019, we had Hurricane Dorian, which many people remember completely devastated the Bahamas for a long time. It stalled there and it worked its way up the coast, closing 15 ports from Puerto Rico up to Virginia. And for Dorian, we had this really interesting opportunity when we went back and interviewed people who were involved in this storm about what some of the findings were, the successes and challenges and recommendations. What they found is that their experiences with 2017 with Hurricanes Florence and Michael really prepared them to take action and get their contracts in order and their pre-placement pre-identified, so that Dorian was actually, although there wasn't much of a direct hit, they felt like they were able to exercise all of that preparation and that the MTS is indeed evolving and becoming more resilient. And we see those groups as an ability to share some of those findings and work. Next slide. So now we have COVID-19, which is an entirely different sort of disruption than a hurricane, okay? A hurricane typically impacts a regional area, so you are able to isolate the incident and contact your neighboring partners. This COVID-19 was nationwide and it suppressed cargo movements, but there wasn't necessarily a critical area that needed to be focused on. So we are incorporating this pandemic situation into our findings as another layer of preparation so that we are better able to function in a remote environment and in a sort of health issue environment. Next slide. So just to share some of our initial recommendations from this work, this report will be available hopefully in the winter time, but we organized some of these recommendations according to preparation, according to resist and recover and adaptation, those 4 steps within the resilience cycle. Preparation is things like holding regular training and drills to educate, establishing relationships and connections early and often, and exercises to know, how to function in a virtual environment, and how response might occur in that case. During the actual event, having an idea about how we're sharing seamlessly across federal agencies and updating our data as accurate and utilizing a flexible workforce. And then for adaptation actions, having proactive after-action reviews, focusing on what worked well, developing a common operating picture of information that's vital to the response, and then, communicating what those successes were. Next slide. Now, real quickly, I know we're running a little late on time, are some of the quantitative methods. I'll give just a moment for the slide to pop up on my screen, but these are methods that we're finding useful in measuring how the MTS or how shippers are actually moving and adapting to disruptions in real time. So we're able to both watch it while it's happening and look back in the past to see these patterns. And what you're looking at here is AIS data. This is automatic identification system data generated by the Coast Guard and pulled down by tools we manage at the Army Corps. We also have data on waterborne commerce, many of you are probably also familiar with, to try to unpack some of these trends that are happening here. And this is Puerto Rico, just sort of a interesting graphic, I think, outlining the tankers in orange at the bottom of the island, making their, bulk commodity deliveries, and then San Juan in the north, with a whole variety of cargo and passenger vessels. Next slide. So there's also lots of ways to use this data, this AIS data, to develop metrics and indices. And here's several examples of AIS data that we're using, and then data that we're using through a professor named Austin Becker at University of Rhode Island, who does work on indicators of exposure and sensitivity, and interviews with folks in regions to attempt to describe some of the major drivers of resilience issues in a particular area. So in the top left are net vessel counts in and out of the port of Savannah. So you can see the hurricane arriving, vessel counts dropping as expected, and then the time it takes for the port to recover to a steady state after the storm is something that can be measured. We're also looking at networks of how geographic groups of ports interact with each other. These are domestic origin and destinations. And what we're trying to do here is understand redundancy. Say Houston closes down due to, another hurricane or something in the channel. Well, what are the ports nearby that could potentially absorb some of that cargo? And therefore, federal agencies like the Corps would need to consider that in making investment decisions on channel deepenings and things like that. This is just the beginning of research that we can do within this area, and some ideas that we're tossing around. Next slide, or click forward a little bit, Chase. There's also things like the Coast Guard's Marine Transportation System Recovery Plan, port management self-assessments that NOAA has, toolkits that are available online to help you understand climate resilience. Keep clicking, keep clicking. There's a lot of tools out there to help you understand resilience in the coasts. This has been a big topic for the past couple of years. So what that means is there's an overload, and it's really hard to wade your way through it, especially if you don't think about resilience every day like I do. Next slide. So this brings me to our next research approach, which is that there's a disparity between all of these tools that are available to folks and then information on how to actually use them. So CISA, a part of DHS, is funding a study to develop a port resilience assessment guide to take this existing body of knowledge that's been developed and help create a user-friendly resource for assessing resilience of really complicated infrastructure like the marine transportation system. Well, specifically the marine transportation system. Next slide. And how it's doing that, this particular guide, we have decided to organize all of those tools according to scope, whether or not it's a single port or an inland waterway, which was mentioned earlier. Well, inland waterways have really unique, I guess, issues related to redundancy. A lock breaks, and there's not a whole lot of other ways you can get the barge down the river. Then there's also port networks, so how ports work together within a region, or how shippers utilize ports within a region. And then according to tiers, so what a decision maker is actually wanting to get out of understanding the resilience, whether or not it's just understanding the functions of the system, and who their stakeholders are, what some easy wins are, or moving up in complication and in cost to finally get to something really detailed where you might have information on how alternatives may actually impact your resilience. If you, raise a terminal by X number of feet, what does that mean for your resistance to storm surge, for example? Next slide. And we hope that in the end, this guide project is going to provide people with information on tools that are reasonable and available according to their needs, and that fit within a typical project management plan, or follow the typical process of a project. And we're also providing additional guidance for how to pull together stakeholders to talk about critical functions for infrastructure and the dependencies they might have on each other, how to understand risk in response to hazards, and how to implement results to actually make decisions on them. So I think that's my next slide, or that's my last slide, and I will cede the floor to our moderator. Thank you.
Catherine, thank you very much. And I think you could probably be prepared for a few questions on the hurricane system, given that, the most recent impact that we saw from Laura, and the fact that Sally's pounding away near Mobile, Alabama today would probably be on everybody's mind. But thank you very much for that presentation. And I want to thank all the panelists, and I want to move to the Q&A right now. And what I'd like to do, and I understand Rear Admiral Timmy, you're still on the line with us, so I'm delighted that you were able to stay with us. And sir, if you'd like, I'd like to offer you the chance to maybe put out a question to any one of the panelists or all of them, if you like.
Well, thank you. I think, did I get the technology right?
You nailed it. Absolutely.
All right. Is my mask off? Got that right? No, I want to thank the panelists for their time, and for going through the presentations with us. There was a lot of sidebar conversations here as we kind of tracked the data that we were looking at. We're like, hey, that's our data. Where'd that come from? And then we had a sidebar conversation on PANC. I will go back to one of the questions I had, I think, was for Mr. Pollack there in the Port of Corpus Christi, as we talked about what the bulk liquid looked like out there. And you noted a couple of really good years. I'm wondering, is that, and I'm just totally personal interest here, more of the professional or a little bit of professional, how are we looking at your projections there? Because we've seen, as we saw oil go negative for delivery, I think it was May futures were minus 42 or something. We saw a little bounce back. All my conversations with the folks in the oil patch for the OSVs, what's laid up, and then I heard, you were a net exporter there in Corpus, right? You guys run a different model there. A lot of the folks I deal with are saying, aha, things are bad, and just kind of resolving those 2 points of view.
Sure. Yeah. And I'm struggling. I'm trying to think of a way to ground this in the infrastructure conversation. But the straight answer is the last 4 months for us, frankly, just haven't been as bad as we expected. We set a tonnage record last month for our 94-year history. I know there's a bit of cognitive disconnect there between what you're seeing in, with oil prices hovering around $40 a barrel and those volume of exports. But I say that differently. There's no surprise about international demand for affordable, reliable, light sweet crude from the U.S. I understand that what we see is some uncertainty on the upstream side in terms of what is economical to produce. But there's no question that the international demand that our gateway accommodates is still very much there. We're also the timing of the demand destruction of the last 6 months in some sense was a little bit the event was not fortuitous, but it would have been much worse for us had it happened 6 months prior for a few reasons. We saw a few pipelines from the West Texas shale plays come online to the Port of Corpus Christi, sort of in the very end of last year, very beginning of this year, prior to all that demand destruction we saw in March. So, pipelines are not fungible assets, as is the case with most infrastructure. It's built for a protracted period, and a period that is intended to outlast economic cycles. And in that sense, we had whatever volumes were being produced were still coming in our direction. And so that helped to buoy us in the face of what would otherwise have been pretty erratic demand cycles. The second thing for us is that, even though we are very much an energy port, that energy takes a lot of forms. Natural gas liquids, liquefied natural gas. We're thrilled that we are home to one of the major Cheniere production facilities on the Gulf Coast. Cheniere's contracts, Cheniere pre-sells everything it's going to produce. I mean, that's the way that the natural gas, the liquefied natural gas space works. But it's interesting the way that manifests in terms of good movements through our port, because many of those contracts are take or pay contracts. So Cheniere's revenues may be stable in the form of, even in the face of appreciable demand destruction, we will not necessarily see those movements through the gateway. We're happy to say that we've started seeing those ships sail again over the last month. So, really interesting paradigms that I think are going to take a long time to sort of unpack in retrospect. But I think what we've seen in summary is that the oil prices have hovered just at a level where producers are staying in the game, because we're seeing enough demand to keep that balance there. I mean, I think despite the sort of unprecedented drop in pricing that we saw in the spring, which really was a very short-lived anomaly, I think that when we see barrel prices in the low 40s, it's just enough. I think there are a lot of folks in this call who are as well or better equipped to cogitate on the economics, but that's sort of my view at the moment.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. That's an enlightening viewpoint there on some of those things. You just don't see it here from Coast Guard headquarters. Like, oh, what's going on down there? So great, thank you. Sure. Mr. Facilitator, shall I continue back? Chris, you want me to ask another one?
Sure, go at it. Yep.
So Dr. Horst, I think that I had seen your presentation or the materials in some discussions with Inland River stuff with the Army Corps a few years ago. Is that right? Or am I conflating some of that information? I mentioned it because, go ahead.
Possibly work that we did with the ASCE back in 2012 was a pretty widely distributed and widely known study that we did on ports and inland waterways. Right.
And so and again, this is just for any of the panelists, or actually anyone who's got some insights here, as we've looked at the injection of federal spending in this pandemic. There was some discussion of infrastructure spending, and to my recollection, to my best of my knowledge, I don't really see that infusion of an infrastructure bill that's come out in the last few years or even got traction during this. Are we seeing an opportunity here in any other upcoming WRDA bill, spending bill, to get some infrastructure spending into the discussion?
So certainly, infrastructure has had advocates from all sides for quite
Yeah.
some time. Everybody says they want to improve infrastructure. We haven't actually done all that much, despite all of the talk. But in many ways, during and immediately after a recession is the best time to improve infrastructure. And so now it really is a very good time to begin to make those improvements. So the CMTS baseline was formulated in 2019 at a time when unemployment rates were below 4%. And so in times like that, when labor markets are tight and most businesses are running at or near full capacity, major new initiatives often tend to pull resources from other areas. So those initiatives pull workers from other jobs and divert materials that might have gone elsewhere. And so as a result, in times like that, US exports tend to fall and imports tend to rise. At the same time, interest rates tend to rise under those conditions, and that discourages spending on automobiles, houses, and other assets. And so under such conditions, even while long-run benefits of making the improvements might remain, the short-run benefits from the construction itself often are limited. But on the other hand, when the economy is weak, when many unemployed people need jobs and businesses have spare capacity, then additional spending on infrastructure can provide a substantial boost to the economy, both by raising employment directly to support the construction projects, and also indirectly as higher incomes and spending cascade through the economy. And so right now, as pandemic restrictions ease, it's a good time to shift from the financial relief programs that were appropriate early in the pandemic, while many business and personal activities were restricted, and instead now move towards policies that actually would stimulate additional economic activity. And so making infrastructure improvements now would provide immediate benefit by raising employment and incomes, as well as providing long-run benefits that by improving the ability of US firms to compete in world markets.
Thank you.
Okay, Admiral, I might comment to your question about legislation that for everybody's interest. There is a bill pending called MTSERA, MTS-ERA, stands for Maritime Transportation System Emergency Relief Act, authored by Peter DeFazio, Democratic Congressman from Oregon, and it had a comparable bill out of the Senate authored by Jeff Merkley in Oregon and supported by Dan Sullivan, a Republican from Alaska, which essentially would create a funding mechanism which heretofore does not exist for the maritime system in order to give Congress a vehicle to appropriate funds, whether it be for pandemics, hurricanes, fires, you name it. And that's an important first step for the what we're talking about here, really, the marine transportation system to get access to emergency funding. Secondly, on stimulus, which was what Ron was talking about, in the THUD bill for fiscal year 2021, there was a special appropriation of $1 billion for what's called PIDP. It's the Port Infrastructure Development Program. That would be a historic number if that becomes, part of the FY 2021 budget. It would certainly be something that the ports would welcome readily in order to direct money towards infrastructure improvements. Let me quickly shift into a couple of questions for our other panelists. And Admiral, thank you for those earlier questions. For Guy St. John, if you could give me your thoughts on this, is how do we win the hearts and minds of young, junior and senior high school age students to help them realize, how cool our industry is. I've always felt for many, many years that, we fought the battle of cooler, sexier industries. But I think what you were talking about points to the need to bring younger people into our industry.
You're absolutely right. And I don't believe that you talk to the kids so much as you talk to the parents, because the parents are the influencers. The parents have to the parents have to learn that because they get a pair of steel-toe boots and a hard hat and they're going to go to work inside of a port environment or shipyard environment does not put them at danger, does not put them at risk. It gives them a chance to excel. It gives them a chance at a career. It gives them a chance to have a leg up at the end of 4 years in that environment, instead of owing $40,000 to $50,000 in student debt, to have already probably be making that much and on the way to a better lifestyle, and to more money. So it's the parents that are the influencers. Also, I'm a student of the public school system. I'm an outcome of that. But the public schools are graded on the number of students that they have applied to and then are accepted by colleges and universities, not the number of students that they put to work. And I think that's, over the past 40 or 50 years, has been, as we've outsourced a lot of the manufacturing and technology jobs, not necessarily much, IT across the board. We just assumed that we would be able to outsource a lot of that. And it turns out that you really do need a plumber when you need a plumber for your downstairs bathroom. And when your HVAC goes out, you got to call an HVAC guy. And it doesn't matter if you're in the Port Authority or if you're at home. So there are opportunities that are out there with small and medium businesses that are willing to hire. There are opportunities out there to engage with the public school system and the vocational education centers to create more of a throughput through those institutions of young men and women who are ready to go to work and want to go to work with healthcare or maritime or transportation. And then if you can reach the parents, you'll be able to reach the kids.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Catherine, I wanted to ask you a question. I think it was pretty amazing to see all the tools that our industry has to access better preparation for any one of a number of risks that we all face in our business. But this is kind of a question that comes from home for me, is as I contemplate the hurricane season that we're now in and the most recent years, and these arguments that we hear debated in the media about the science and what the science says. From your perspective, are the hurricanes getting worse and likely to continue to get, meaning more severe and pose greater risk? Or is this just, in the historical context of things, a cycle where they're pretty severe and they might likely go into another cycle? What's your view on that?
Well, I would suggest that we can't necessarily expect them to get any better than they are right now. So in the past couple years, we've seen a lot of very intense storms and a lot of flooding, especially on the inland waterway system. And I think that a lot of the data shows that we can expect this to be a trend moving forward. Yeah, this isn't something that is probably going to go away anytime soon, unfortunately.
All right. Thank you. Jeff, I think we got time for maybe just one or two questions. How do you partner with external stakeholders, both regionally and nationally, to share data and to support in the support of emerging technologies?
Was the first word in that question, have we?
How do you?
How do we?
It should be, have you? And if so, how do you?
It's a great question. In our case, I'll start with the how we have, because it's the easier part of that question. There is a group called the Texas Innovation Alliance, which is organized out of the University of Texas. It was born out of the funding opportunity around the Smart Cities Challenge. Smart Cities Challenge, because of its nature, necessitates a pretty intensive multi-party effort in the application process. And so what we find is that the cities that aren't funded have done a lot of work and have initiatives that they often wish to carry forward. That was the case in Austin around trying to cultivate a designated testing ground for connected and autonomous vehicles. And so the Texas Innovation Alliance, in our case, has proven to be, they're about to hold their 5th annual event. It's proven to be a great state level mixing ground for agency, private sector, so tech developers, tech users, private and public sector interests. And so in our case, we're lucky that in Texas we have this ready-made framework for peer-to-peer sharing around innovative opportunities in mobility. And there's been a steady focus on freight mobility as part of that alliance. And frankly, I don't know whether there are good analogs to that in other states, but it's a fantastic model and it's worked very well for partners across the state. I hope it's something, there have been some national case studies of it. I hope it's gaining some traction. So for us, we spend a lot of time trying to network with our peers around the state. We try our best to, when prevailing conditions allow, to get to DC and interact with peers through AAPA events. I mean, I think that we've also seen, and we've been intent on participating in federal funding opportunities, and we think that those in particular have an opportunity to amplify case study applications in one port around the port system. So, the infra program, for example, building infrastructure at one port. I personally am of the mind that any federal funding opportunity for infrastructure in a single port should be coupled with a communication. You should have a requirement for a communications piece, a case study piece, so that we're amplifying lessons learned in a single port around the port environment, so around the port network in the country. So I think the answer is we've done this to some extent. I don't think that I don't think the national infrastructure has realized its full potential in terms of the way that we could capitalize on lessons learned and technological applications in an individual port. I think that our experience in engaging with other ports suggests that all of us are eager for more opportunities like that, more sort of social infrastructure over which to exchange lessons learned. Because, and my boss says this well, if you've seen one port, you've seen one port. Most of us are not in competition with each other just by the nature of the commodities that come through our gateways. And so I think that the system overall is really ripe for collaborative learning in that respect, without the detraction of what would be competition.
We use that line a lot at AAPA. If you've seen one port, you've seen one port, because it is so true. They are all so unique. But I think the story, more broadly for the maritime transportation system, MTS, it's a powerful story. But honestly, we struggle to get the appreciation of the public writ large. And it's not just the square states in the middle of the country, flyover states, if you want to call them. Even the coastal states, people that live in coastal communities do not connect the dots between the commerce that's happening at their seaport and what's coming off ships or being loaded on ships and their own daily lives. And I think therein lies an enormous opportunity for us to get the message across of how important and potent the system that we're all part of is. And quite frankly, one of the reasons that inspired me to want to take this job and get involved in this business, because I do think it's a great story. But people don't travel through ports; they travel through airports, and they know the infrastructure in airports, and they see how it affects them as individuals. They don't make the same connection. So again, I think that's an opportunity for us to try and close that gap, and I think we'll get more support on all these needs that we have. But with that, I'd like to thank, again, Rear Admiral Tibney for joining the session today, and all the panelists. You were excellent. By the way, Ron, I wanted to mention, we use some of the data that your most recent report in our federal advocacy efforts on Capitol Hill. I testified in front of the Coast Guard Marine Transportation Subcommittee back on May 29th, and I was quoting data from your report. So thank you very much for that. I think this is a good example of everybody pulling together and harnessing, our collective strengths to get the right message across. But with that, I want to thank everyone for being part of this webinar today. And we look forward to it when we can do this live in the same room, in the same place. Until then.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Take care. All the best.